I feel like there's a lot of stuff that, I wish I had known when I was getting started out, and how high compensation could go, and what does the result of that mean when you make that much money. And this is really the whole point of Taro, is like sharing these tips or thoughts that you don't normally have access to within a high quality group of people. So there are 5 different parts to this presentation, and I'm going to run through some of them faster than others based on your input. Okay, the first is I wanted to share the raw data of over 4.5 years at Meta. How did my every single performance review I got, along with the resulting compensation change. Then I'll talk about equity and how does that impact compensation, negotiation. Alex and I have talked about this a few times already, but I just want to add some nuances to negotiation and how to think about that as a tech worker. And then the last 2 parts are more personal. First is about how did I approach my work throughout that time at Facebook? How many hours did I put in? Was I stressed out? And then finally, I'll talk about when I was making that much money, how did that impact my mentality to spending? How did that impact my thoughts on traveling or going somewhere or buying coffee every day, right? And that's what I got a ton of questions about. So to help me decide, where I should spend more time, can you all quickly answer this poll about where you would like to see me spend more time? I'll give you about a minute to answer that, but I'm going to move on. So the punchline of this whole presentation is I worked at Facebook, now known as Meta, for about 4.5 years, and I ended up making in my last year $823,000. And I documented this in the video. Here's the progression. So I'm going to not spend too much time on this. I'm going to assume many of you have watched the video already. I actually am curious. It's not a formal poll, but if you haven't seen the video, can you give me like a thumbs up or a reaction in Zoom? I'm kind of just curious to see if there's a significant portion of people who have not seen the video. Okay, a couple of people haven't seen it. John, Suraj, Alex. I'm gonna, Alex dropped a link. I really would recommend watching that. I spent a lot of time just trying to really condense a ton of information into this 10-minute video roughly. I'll do like a very high level overview here, but the majority of the hour that we have today, I'm gonna spend going deeper into, the kind of consequences of that much compensation. So here are the results of the poll. It looks like the majority of people, 51%, want to see how I achieved the promotion to staff engineer, along with tips and then a smaller percentage about the behind the scenes of the industry, or tips of the industry, and then finally behind the scenes with psychology, taxes, etc. All right, so it's kind of even. So I think I'll spend more time than I thought on like the actual mechanics and data, because it seems like a lot of people haven't seen the video. But I also want to spend significant time in the latter half talking about the behind the scenes look. All right, and then Alex, thanks for sharing that video link. Please do watch it. Okay, so quick logistical note or like background. When I'm talking about one of the big things that helped my compensation quite a bit was I got promoted from senior level to staff level at Meta. And the terminology is confusing. So Google and Facebook, they refer to the level above senior as staff engineer. That's L6 or E6 at Meta. At Amazon, the closest equivalent to a staff engineer is actually a principal engineer, right? So when someone says I'm a principal at Amazon, it's kind of like a high-end staff engineer at Google or Meta, and that's the terminology I'll be using. The terminology from Facebook, because that's where I feel like I really matured and grew up as an engineer. Senior engineer is a terminal level. So the majority of people, I would say, don't get beyond senior engineer. And then when you get to staff, it's like usually the top 10 or 20% of the engineering population. All right, here is the pay stub of December 2021. You can look at the screenshot here. This is a pay stub I got from December 5th, 2021. So most of the year had gone by. The only other change in my compensation is that I would have been making, I think, 2 more paychecks. So like the regular line, that number would have gone up slightly. So in fact, the actual total comp I made in 2021 would have been closer to 840,000 if you assume 2 more paychecks of $9,000 each. But I only had a screenshot from 2021 December 5th. That's what I showed in the video. The first line, performance bonus. Facebook or Meta gives out bonuses twice a year. And so this line is referring to the second half of 2020. That bonus gets paid out in March of 2021, right? So this pay stub is about all my comp that I received in the calendar year of 2021. And so this performance bonus is the one I received in March 2021, along with you get another bonus payout in September of every year. And so those two combined led to about $58,000 in bonuses. The gym reimbursement is I got a 24-hour fitness membership, which honestly was kind of stupid because Facebook has amazing gyms. The reason I got a membership worth $760 was because when I was traveling, I went back home to Michigan or like visit my parents in Michigan, or I would travel elsewhere. I thought that, hey, it'd be nice to have a membership at 24 Hour Fitness. I can go to the gym anywhere. It turned out I never went to the gym, at least not with 24 Hour Fitness. So that was kind of a waste, but you know, it's free money. So I guess here's the other caveat. Facebook paid for the gym membership. I think they paid up to $2,000 a year, or at that time it was $3,000 a year. But the reason it shows up as me receiving compensation is that these are benefits that the company is giving you. And so even though I didn't pay for anything out of pocket for the gym membership, it still counts as income. And so I get taxed on it. That's why it's important to still keep that in mind. All right, the next line is IMP GTL. Someone put in the chat or just unmute and tell me if you know what GTL means or what it stands for. Does anyone know? Yeah, oh, it's not a language model. Okay, GTL stands for Group Term Life Insurance, and IMP means imputed. So an imputed benefit is something like beyond your salary, which is a benefit given to you. Like some people might get like a company car. You know, I never got a company car, but you know, some people, company car or gym membership, those are all imputed benefits. And so this is referring to another benefit, another imputed benefit, where Facebook was paying for my life insurance. And every paycheck they would take out $23, or they would kind of pay me in some sense $23, and that added up to $579 a year. And the life insurance at Facebook, in case any of you are curious, is actually amazing. So they would pay, like, if you died, which I had no intention of dying, but you know, it was nice to hear that, you know, Facebook really cared. If you died while being a full-time employee at Meta, they would pay 3 times your salary. So in my case, if I was getting paid, you know, something like $230,000 a year, I would my survivors, my wife, other people, would immediately get paid out $700,000, and they would vest all your equity, and they would continue paying benefits to your survivor. So if you had children or your wife or your husband, then they would continue paying some stipend to them for some number of years. So it's like shockingly good. And that's the theme that you'll hear me come back to a couple times in this presentation, is that Meta really did throw money at employees in a way that most tech companies don't. Okay, IMP legal is the legal protection. I honestly don't know too much about this, but it was only $1.38 per paycheck, so can't complain. I think it's some sort of legal protection that every employee at Meta received if they got into trouble. This next line is, I'm not sure why it's labeled like that, but it actually turns out to be TurboTax. Every employee at Meta, yet another kind of unknown perk is that you get free TurboTax. And so when I was filing taxes, I would use that, and that I didn't pay for it, but it did technically result in like a benefit of $128, which counted as my compensation, and I paid taxes on it. The big one is RSUs, right? Facebook gave out stock to every employee. And that was the lion's share of my compensation when I got to the senior level. $546,000 of my comp came from RSUs at Facebook. And then regular is referring to the base salary, $218,000, and then total hours worked. No one really tracked that. So it's not like someone would check 40 hours a week and that, you know, you get paid twice a week, every 2 weeks. So no one really checked. There was tons of people who just leave at 2 p.m. and log in back at night and do more than 40 hours a week and so on. I mean, you all probably know this working in tech. 2021, I was making the vast majority of my compensation, I would say, in equity, 67%, a smaller amount in bonus and salary. You could count things like the life insurance, TurboTax, free shuttles, free gym, food in here as well. But frankly, if you zoom out, the total aggregate value of that to me as an individual employee might have been $5,000. And so the slice of the pie for that was fairly minor. I think I would not encourage anyone here to make a decision about where to work based off of those fringe benefits. Here's the total comp per half. So before I joined, I was making about $390,000 in total compensation. And I'm going to walk through quickly each performance review and how it changed my comp, along with a big input into this is the Facebook stock price. And so I go into more detail again in the video, in the YouTube video. So I'm not going to spend too much time here. But just a couple things I want to comment on. One is that from the time that I was at Facebook, 2017 until early 2022, the Meta stock price, the Facebook stock price, went from $170 a share to $300 a share. So that's up 76%. And that really did help. Everyone at Meta who was working there saw a really nice bump in their compensation because so much of your pay comes from stock. So here's the graph of the duration that I worked. And so if you zoom out, if you squint a little bit, you can kind of tell, right, that the shape of this graph is almost the same as the shape of this graph, which is my total comp. And there's a reason for that. The other thing to keep in mind is that Facebook is really generous with giving out additional equity grants every year that you've worked there. And so by the time you get to year 4, you actually have 4 different equity grants stacked up on top of each other, leading to many RSUs that are vesting in every period. And so you can, again, see like after I got my initial 4-year grant, then I got several more, such that in 2021, I was vesting almost 2,000 shares of Facebook in that half. And so if you pretend like the value of Facebook stock is like 200, it's actually more now. But at $200 per share, in 2021 H1, I was making 400K in that half alone from Facebook stock, roughly, right? And there's some math there, but that's how to think about it. These equity refresh grants can stack up. Here's every performance review I got. I started out meeting expectations. So actually, let me give you a primer here. I just dropped in the chat something called promotions at FYI, where it's a initiative from Taro, from us, about documenting how do companies evaluate their employees. And so Meta is very, very structured. Every 6 months, you get a rating. And that rating given to you by your manager will tell you, are you meeting all the expectations for your role? Are you below expectations? Or are you doing really well? And so luckily, I never got the below expectation rating, although about 10% of employees do every half. I started out meeting expectations, and then it went up and down. I did hit this like greatly exceeds GE rating 3 times, and that led to a pretty substantial bump in my bonus and my salary every time that happened. All right, here are all the pay stubs. I'm not going to go through these in too much detail, but 2017, I started out with a salary coming into Facebook with 170K. It went up slightly because I was just only in the company for a few months at this time. And honestly, I didn't do that well for the first few months. In the next half, the first 6 months of 2018, I got a 14K bonus. And then it took me a year to really get comfortable. And so 2018 H2 is when I started to really feel like, okay, I know what I'm doing. I'm a competent engineer. I know how to help the team. I got a greatly exceeds expectation, and that led to a pretty huge payout of $26,000 of bonus. 2019 H2, again, was probably my most productive period at the whole company. So I got not only a pretty huge bonus payout, $31,000 that half, and I crossed 200K salary, but I also received additional equity, which is like a one-time stock grant given to you on top of your normal stock grant. And that was really a sign that, okay, people are valuing what I'm doing here. And then the last 2020 H1 was COVID, so they actually didn't have a formal process. There's no screenshot for that. 2020 H2 is when I finally got promoted to staff engineer, which is called IC6 or E6. And then 2021 H1, I moved over to management. So I was a manager for about a year in 2021. I worked the full half in the second half of 2021. So, July through January of 2021, I worked that whole period, but I left Meta in January 2022. And so I didn't actually get any kind of performance feedback or result from that last period I worked. All right, I'm blowing through this. So if anyone has a question, please put it in the chat or raise your hand. Otherwise, I'm going to keep going. Michael's asking, why do you think the knowledge is so hidden? What are the factors that make it hard to find, comprehend? So that's a good question. I think that part of it is that as a society, people don't like talking about money. And so when it comes to performance, it's something so core to your job is a big part of your identity. And when you talk about, oh, I didn't do well at work, or I did really well at work, that can be something which people don't want to share. And that is directly tied to how much you make. And so when you talk about, oh, I got a GE rating, I got a greatly exceeds expectation rating, or I got promoted to staff engineer, you're effectively, in some ways, revealing how much you're making per year. And that can be a scary thing. Aditya, I'm going to talk about taxes in a little bit. Okay, the next section is about thinking about equity. So I put this graph in another YouTube video I made, and it's on Taro as well. But one of the things to comment on is that the way you become wealthy, the way you become rich in tech is by owning equity. And this is something that people really need to pay more attention to. When you're at a traditional company, so traditional company in my mind is like General Motors or some consulting firm or from freelance agency, then the majority of your compensation will be salary and then maybe a small amount in bonus. And very few people will give out meaningful equity. They might give you like a stock purchase plan, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, but those are usually not that good. If you get into big tech, you start to see, wow, I'm actually getting, $25,000 a year in Facebook stock. And that can really add up and be a meaningful contributor to how much you get paid. And then finally, when you get to big tech as a senior level or staff level, like I was, then you can start to see that yellow portion is a huge portion of what you end up making. So like any tech bro, I'm an adherent to the religion of Naval Ravikant, right? Who here is not? So he had this mega viral tweet a few years ago about how to get rich without getting lucky. And literally the first tweet in this thread is seek wealth, not money or status. Wealth is having assets that earn while you sleep. And that is what you're doing when you get equity in a company. So that the manifestation of this statement that Naval is saying for a tech worker, for an engineer, is you should really be optimizing for having ownership in your company. That is how you build wealth. There's so many people here who worry about, I want to get $5,000 more in their base salary. When you're doing that, you're worried about pennies when you should be worried about Benjamins, right? Like you should be worried about the $100 bills and the much more substantial things that add up to your compensation. You should not, in my opinion, be worried about an extra $5,000 in salary. Okay, when I left in January 2022, I did leave a ton of equity on the table. So this is a screenshot from Morgan Stanley, which was like the broker that we used to actually be able to receive stock at Facebook. So you can see that I got these four different grants, and then the total market value of that at the time that I left Facebook. So I think the screenshot, actually you can tell, right? Like on this particular day, they took the screenshot, Facebook stock is worth $323 per share. And so the amount of value that I was leaving on the table, if I stuck around for 4 more years, would have been 713,000. And actually that number would have gone up, right? Because I mentioned that every year Facebook would give you additional equity grants. And so if I did stick around for 4 more years, I probably would have, it would have ended up being something like $1 million or 1.2 million. And if you back into that, that ends up being like 300K or 400K of equity per year, right? One thing that's important to note is when does vesting happen, right? So a lot of companies historically have a 1-year cliff, which means that you don't get any equity for a year. And then at the 1-year mark, you get a big chunk. And then you get smaller grants of equity more regularly after that. So what's interesting is, in the height of the boom, the tech boom that happened in 2020 and 2021 with COVID, I actually remember a lot of companies removed this. So if you joined Robinhood or joined Meta, after 3 or 4 months, you could actually get your first equity grant. If someone has worked, I know Alex, that was Alex's experience at Robinhood. If someone else has this experience, like if you joined Meta in 2019, 2020, and you saw this, I'd love to hear from you. Just like raise your hand and I'll unmute you. But this is something that happened when, a lot of companies were really desperate for good engineers, and they thought, okay, if we remove that 1-year cliff where you don't have to stick around for so long, maybe we can attract more people or better people. Like one comment on that is I actually don't think that should really impact you, because your mentality as an engineer should not be to go in and work at a company for 3 months or 6 months and get some equity and bounce. That's the wrong way to grow your career. You should be coming in with the intention of sticking around for 2 years. And so the fact that some companies are removing that 1-year cliff doesn't really, in my opinion, change how we should act. The other thing is the increments of these bumps that happen in that graph, like that stair step that you see in the second half of the graph. How frequently do those happen? So one important thing here is that at Meta, you get an equity grant, like you vest equity every 3 months. There were 4 times a year, February, May, August, and November 15th, that you got the next, and if you contrast that with Google, you got a new grant, a new vest cycle every month. And that actually has a pretty big impact. So I left Meta in January of 2022, right? If it was like Meta, or sorry, if the stock vesting was like Google and it was given every month, I for sure would have stuck around until the January vest date in order to make an additional $20,000, $30,000, right? But my mentality was, I'm not going to stick around until February 15th. I have things to do. I have this company that I want to build. At that time, we didn't know what it was, but I wanted to go out and build out Taro, what would become Taro. And I didn't want to wait until February 15th to do that. So I ended up leaving in January. But if at Google, like you can be a lot more strategic about saying, hey, there's actually another vesting date happening in like a week. And if I stick around for that week, I'll get a pretty huge bump in how much I'm making. And so the other thing you'll notice is that because of this pattern, there's a very clear cycle on when people leave their company. You would be an idiot if you left Meta. If you worked at Meta, you would be an idiot if you left on November 14th. I remember November 15th of 2021, which is like my peak earning capacity. On November 15th, I think the amount of stock I was vesting on that single day was something like $150,000. It was like a huge, huge amount of money. And so if you leave on November 14th, you get 0. If you stick around until November 15th, you get 150K. So you have to be really careful about when you're timing an exit. Equity distribution is another thing to think about. So Amazon and TikTok, and I believe Snapchat too, back in the day, they're pretty famous for being back-weighted. And what that means is instead of having 25% of your equity vest each year, it might be something like 10, 10, 40, 40. So you get 10% of your equity in the first 2 years and then 40% in years 3 and 4. And what that means is you have to stick around and have loyalty to the company for a much longer duration in order to see that payout. One caveat here is that, from friends who I know who join TikTok, and actually some people in Taro who I've talked to, TikTok will generally give you cash bonuses in the first 2 years. And so it's not purely a worse outcome. Like you could still end up having a really good package from TikTok and Amazon, even if you're only planning to stick around for a year or two, because they might give you a meaningful cash bonus in the first year. Okay, one comment on companies that give out a stock purchase plan or some sort of discount. So this was actually really popular back in the day. Like I remember General Motors and I think Ford and a couple other companies, they had this scheme where it's like, if you buy $10,000 worth of Facebook, or if you buy 10K worth of Ford stock, then you get a 10% discount. So it's kind of like you get $1,000 for free because you're investing in the company. And so my general guideline here is that any company that does this is not going to pay competitively. I have literally never heard of a company which gives out a stock purchase plan to their employees that is going to have really high compensation. So really what you want is, you don't want all these kind of like pay to play type methodologies. You want companies that will just give you a substantial amount of stock every 3 months or every year. That's what you want. You don't want to, in my opinion, if you can help it, don't go to a company which is like, oh, we're going to give you $3,000 worth of stock if you buy our company in the market, right? Those are, in my mind, a no-go. They're generally, like, what I've seen is that these companies will have that plan be worth like, somewhere between 5,000 and 15,000 a year. And I want all of you to focus on $100,000 questions, not $5,000 questions. All right, this is something that doesn't get talked about as much as it should. How often does a company give you an additional equity grant? So at Meta, it was amazing. It's like literally the best I've seen in the industry. Every year you get another grant of equity. When I was at Pinterest, before I worked at Meta, I worked at Pinterest for about 2.5 years. And so when I joined Pinterest, I didn't get another grant of more equity until I worked there for 2 years. And that means that stacking of stock that I mentioned earlier, you don't get as much benefit from that. And that can really bring down your compensation. And in fact, most companies, like if you join a startup, the mentality of most startup founders and the leadership team of any startup is that you come in and you earn, like, let's say you join a Series A startup as employee number 10 or employee number 15, you get 0.5% of equity, and that will vest over 4 years. You should probably not expect to get any more equity in that company until your 4-year grant is fully vested. And then maybe then, if you are still happy at the company and the company is doing well, they might give you another equity grant. But you should not expect that equity grant to be the same, because presumably the company has done well. And so after 4 years, you're going to get like a 0.1% equity grant, hypothetically. And so, that's like something really important to keep in mind, because when you work in a larger tech company, that is a huge part of how you're able to build up wealth and have those quote unquote golden handcuffs, is that you keep accumulating more and more equity. And the reason this isn't talked about enough, like Michael, you mentioned, Michael, like, how does this, why isn't this talked about enough? Is that this is the information that you're not going to get in an offer letter. Like, they're not going to promise like, oh, every year we're going to give you a certain amount of equity. It will depend on your performance, on your team's performance. How is the company doing? And this is where having a strong community will really help. Like, you should really all benefit from Tara, or just build out your network of people and say, hey, when you were working at that company, how substantial were your equity refresh grants? All right, another thing is about equity value being fixed or floating. So a lot of companies, due to the downturn, they've shifted to something called a fixed value stock grant. And so what that means is that if the stock price goes up or down, you get the same cash value of that stock. And that means you get downside protection, right? So for example, the valuation of Stripe or Instacart has gone down a lot. And so if you joined and then Instacart went down like 60%, then you still get the same $100,000 or $200,000 of stock value every year, because it's kind of going to reset the number of stock you get. I'm actually curious if anyone works at Stripe or Instacart or Snapchat, I think are the 3 companies that do this. I would love to hear from you right here, if you're open to sharing like exactly how it works. So one of the things about this is that this caps the upside, right? So the beauty of Facebook is that the stock went up 70% throughout the time I was there. And that was a big part of why I was able to make so much in my last year. And so, here's my philosophy, and this is definitely like my bias coming through, is that I would pretty much never work for a company that did the first option, where it would fix the amount of cash value I'm getting each year to, 100K or 200K. I want to take the risk of the company going up, and I want to benefit from the company doing well. Right. So this is something I think John mentioned in the chat just a little while ago. This is my personal perspective. I think for me, the salaries in Silicon Valley and in tech broadly are high enough to cover comfortably all of my living costs. I was able to, pay for rent, buy a car, live my life comfortably. And so what that meant was, as a young person living in California, I wanted to use equity as a high risk bet. I wanted to be risk on. And so if a company said, I am basically going to cap your upside and give you a certain cash value of equity every year, that would be very unattractive to me. I want to be if the stock will double over the next 4 years, I want to take part in that growth. So that's my, just my kind of 2 cents on how to think about that. Okay, and then last thing I want to mention before we dive into like the more like the other parts of the presentation is there's this really weird thing that happens when you sign an offer to join a company, and let's say that you might be like a 1 month or 2 month waiting period where you're wrapping up work or you're going on vacation before you join. So this is a screenshot from my actual offer letter. And the important thing I want to call out here is the share value will be determined by reference to a trailing average closing stock price. And what that means is what they would do is I joined in August of 2017. The board of directors would look at the average stock price for Facebook in all of July, the previous month, and they would average that out. And that would be the the number of Facebook stock I got. So if the average stock price of Facebook was like $100 per share, then that would translate to 6,000 RSUs, right? Does that make sense? 600K divided by 100. If the average stock price was $10, I would get 6,000 RSUs. I'd get 10x more because the price was 10x lower, right? And so what that meant was you would have this really weird kind of dynamic where when I sign the offer letter, I immediately want the stock price to go down, because the further down the stock price is, then that would mean I would get more RSUs, I would get more stock. And as soon as I join the company, then of course I want the stock price to go up, because now I have earned some equity in the company and I want that equity to go up in value. Right. And actually Snapchat, I believe, is actually a very extreme version of this, where they will literally take the previous day stock price, and that will determine the amount of equity you get, the number of shares you get. So for example, if Snapchat had an earnings call yesterday and the stock went down 15%, in some ways you're really happy because that means that now you get way more stock. If the Snapchat price went up 20% the day before you join, you're going to get 20% lower number of stock, and now you're pegged at a much higher baseline. All right, how are we doing? Any questions at this point before I talk about some negotiation stuff that I learned? Can we cover more growth path? I actually don't know if I have too much growth. I have some growth path stuff, Alex, but this is mostly like I'm doing like a behind the scenes of what I learned. And I can take questions about, how I operated as a staff engineer. So negotiation. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the details of why it's important. You all know this, hopefully. We did a masterclass about negotiation. I dropped a link for that. A couple things I want to comment on, which we didn't talk about really, or most people don't think about or talk about. That level is hugely important. When you get to a higher level, then you can unlock a new salary band, a new equity package, right? And the beauty of it, or like the power of it, is that it's not linear. Like the gap between a junior and mid-level engineer might be 20K of compensation, but it's going to go up geometrically from there. The gap between a mid-level and senior might be 50K, and the gap in compensation per year between a senior and staff might be 100 or 120,000. And so if you're able to somehow convince one company that you are actually a senior engineer and not a mid-level engineer, that can translate to literally 50K or more in how much money you take home. And so what that means for all of you and Taro is I would encourage you to go out and get multiple offers. And the thing that's kind of interesting about leveling is that there's no agreed upon standard for what level you should be, right? Like I know people in Taro who they have 5 years of experience, and they have been working at some like no-name company, frankly, or they've been doing freelance work, and they come into big tech and they literally will get leveled as a junior engineer, like an E3 engineer. A lot of people with 5 years will get mid-level. Some people with 5 years of experience will come in as a senior engineer, and then very rarely will you get staff. So you can really have the whole spectrum of what level someone will determine you at. And so my recommendation is if you go out, go and get 3-4 offers, and then use the one with the highest level as like the baseline. And you go in and then you can start getting a much higher equity salary, and you'll use that for your whole career going forward. I put a picture of a Pokeball here because I thought, Pokemon, you level up. So it's fitting. That's my attempt to make a connection. Okay. In case you're curious about how big tech levels people, how does big tech even hire? We have an event here in November 7th from Nikita Gupta, who's the Uber and Amazon recruiter who used to be a recruiter at these companies. And so I would encourage you all to check that out. Alex, do you mind actually? I didn't put the link in my presentation notes. If you could just drop the link for that event so people can RSVP, that would be amazing. Thanks. Okay, and then just one more note about negotiation is signing bonus. This is like the number one tip I have when people in Taro ask about negotiation is just go back to the company. If you actually are willing to accept the offer, go back to the company and tell them, hey, I will sign the offer if you can give me like a $30,000 bonus. $30,000 for a company like Meta or Snowflake or Databricks or Robinhood, really $30K is not that much. They're operating on the scale of billions of dollars a year in revenue. And if they think you're a good engineer and they've spent 5, 6, 10 hours with you talking on the phone and doing interviews, they're probably willing to give you an extra 20 or 30K. And the insight here is that money now is more valuable than money later. And so especially if you're early in career, then it's more acceptable to job hop. Like, you spend a year and a half at a company or 2 years at a company, you move on to the next company. And so if you are able to get a $50,000 signing bonus, that's a huge, huge impact for a 25-year-old, someone who's early in career, compared to, when you become more senior, I would encourage you to put more weight on the equity. And ideally, you can get like $1 million equity package over 4 years. That's $250K a year. You have to stick around to get that value, but you probably will stick around if you're more senior. Did that make sense to people? Okay, I'm gonna speed through this. So yeah, the initial equity grant is super important. So I got $600,000 worth of equity, 150K per year for the first 4 years I was at Meta. That was a pretty significant equity grant compared to other senior engineers at my level, like other E5s. And the beauty of this is that if the company goes up, that will lead to even more of a delta in compensation for you relative to your peers, right? So I would say the average grant for someone at my level was $400,000 when I came in. So I got $200,000 of additional equity value if I stuck around for 4 years. Now, what if the stock price of Facebook doubled? So then that would be $400,000 of additional value that I'm getting compared to someone who came in at 400K. And so I think companies are really willing oftentimes to give you more equity. Okay, so that was a huge rundown of my thoughts on negotiation and how to think about equity and how I did at Meta. If you want to learn the mechanics of how I operate as a staff, and that's what Alex was mentioning in the chat, then one thing that we're trying with Taro is actually have more course-based content rather than like one-off events like this or just like a random collection of content that you have on Taro. It's all great stuff. I love like the questions and answers and discussions that we have on Taro. But one thing we've heard repeatedly is that people want more structure. They want like a proper set of modules to go through and interaction with people. So what we're going to do is have a 2-week course. We're trying out an experiment. We have a 2-week course hosted on Maven. And so I really want to make that as compelling for each of you as possible. And so if you are interested in that, there's a waiting list it's a waiting list and also like a Q&A where I can ask you where you're going to answer what you're looking for. And it's designed if you're like a mid-level or especially if you're a senior engineer and you want to break into staff, I'm going to try and make it really worth your while and share some frameworks that helped me and hopefully will help you. And if you're in Taro Premium, then we'll figure out a way to kind of get you a steep discount relative to other people. Okay. Can I do a quick gut check? How are we doing in the last 20 minutes that we have? Thumbs up. Any questions? All right, I'm seeing 2 thumbs up. So, all right. If there are questions, please just pause me anytime. I think you all should be able to unmute. So there are 2 more sections I want to cover. One is how did I approach my work and my opinions about how you should approach your work as an engineer. And then after that, I want to talk about the personal finance side of it. So a question I got a lot after the video was how many hours did I work? And the answer is that it depends. It depends a lot on what period you're talking about. For the first 2 years, I actually worked pretty hard, probably on average 60 hours a week. I almost always had lunch and dinner at Facebook. And if I woke up early enough, I would also have breakfast there. And it wasn't all like work of I would go to the gym occasionally. I would go on a walk with a colleague. I would go to the micro kitchen a lot and just get coffee or get a snack. But I did spend substantial time in the office working, but then it did decline or kind of plateau at some point. And in H2 2021, like my last real period at the company, I worked way less. I was pretty checked out, to be honest. I probably worked 30 hours a week. So one thing to keep in mind is that only a few projects will matter. If you might have your finger in like 10 different projects, right? You might have some relationship to people or 8 or 10 different projects that you might be involved in. Out of those 8 or 10 projects, only 1 or 2 will matter. And so a big part of your job as an engineer is figure out what are those projects that matter, where you can have a bigger impact compared to other projects, and focus on those. And when I came into college, I was actually going to be a physics major. And so there's this like really interesting graph I found about how, when a sound wave is emitted, how does that translate? How does that decay over time? And so when you first produce a sound, there's something called the attack period. I actually didn't study this. This is something I Googled for, so I don't know the details. But you have an attack period where the sound comes out and it immediately goes to a higher volume, and then it decays, and then it kind of plateaus at the sustained period, and then finally release. And I think that's a good metaphor for how to think about work. You should come in when you are at a new company. I want you all to attack the work, spend more time than you think is normal, then spend more time than you probably would otherwise, and really build up the relationships and the code to do well. And then once you've done that, then you can kind of go back to a more sustainable life. And then when you're figuring out your next move, it'll go down. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that your life will also change and evolve over time, right? And so you should be opportunistic about when are you putting in a lot of the deep work and a lot of the hours compared to other times in your life, which might be more busy with other things, right? So 2017, when I joined Facebook, I was ramping up. 2018 was probably the most busy time. I put in a ton of time because we were launching the product to the public. There was a ton of bug fixing and feature development and just like collaboration that happened. In the first half of 2019, I got married. And so honestly, that was a period where I didn't do as much. I was so busy with like all the wedding festivities. The second half of 2019 was my most productive period ever. I didn't have any of the busyness of the wedding or other things going on outside my life. So I committed to working really hard, and that paid off. 2020 was when COVID started, and I started to take YouTube more seriously. It's like an outside of work thing. And I committed like 10 hours a week just building out a YouTube channel. In the second half of 2020, I did a collaboration with Free Code Camp, which is a huge online education platform. And that I think really did help me in terms of reaching a ton of people. And I spent a ton of time doing that course. And so frankly, I didn't actually spend as much time in that half on Facebook work because I was doing things outside. 2021 was the start of when I really became more serious about working with Alex, and we did a ton of projects, different webinars, and different things that we tried out, which eventually became Taro. The second half of 2021, I continued working with Alex, and I also had a course that I published on LinkedIn Learning. So my point here is that I had a lot of things going on either at work or at things that I was pursuing outside of work. And that's going to be normally how people operate, right? You should be deliberate about, hey, here's a side project or my kid or my family that needs time right now. I'm going to take a step back from work. And that's totally fine as long as you have a plan on how to, sustain your performance and achieve the goal you want. Like, not everyone wants to get promoted every cycle. Not everyone wants to work super hard, and that's okay. So again, going back to the wisdom from Neville, 40-hour work weeks are a relic of the industrial age. Knowledge workers like us, we function like athletes, train and sprint, and then rest and reassess. And so he's talking about it from the perspective of a given work week where, Monday might be your deep work day, Tuesday you relax, and so on. I think the same philosophy applies when you zoom out to a 1 or 2 year time horizon. There might be some months or some halves where you work really, really hard. And then the next month, you frankly don't work as much. And that's okay. And I think big tech allows you that flexibility to do that. Okay. The last section I have, and then I'd love to open it up to questions, is around how I approached money, especially as I was making more and more each year. How did that impact my mentality when it comes to spending? So one thing that was probably a big a big change in my day-to-day life was how I thought about small purchases. Growing up, it was like a very middle class life. There were periods where I was quite worried about money. In high school, I literally wrote down every single expense I had. I would write down in a spreadsheet, this coffee, a lunch with a friend, and I was really careful about how much I was spending. When I got into Meta, and especially when the stock price went up and I started to do well at work, I stopped tracking all of that. It got to the point where, every month, the end of the month, I would have substantially more in my bank account than I started with. And that's a pretty amazing feeling, right? It's like the number keeps going up. And the way I would think about it is, it was kind of like a lubricant for the things I would do. So if I wanted to get a coffee, I would just do it. If I wanted guacamole with my burrito, I would just do it. Like, unlike before where I thought about these decisions, I was definitely a lot more just free with it. And the other thing is, like, working at Facebook, a lot of your day-to-day expenses are taken care of. I had breakfast, lunch, and dinner there. Oftentimes, every employee at Facebook would get a phone. And so my phone plan was actually paid for by Facebook. I didn't have a car for a few years while I was working there because I used a shuttle. There was a gym on site. There was a ton of free snacks and free drinks at the campus. So I really was a lot more able to spend money when I was working there. I mean, to be honest, I'm still a stingy person. There's like this scarcity mindset that I can't get rid of. But I think I'm not as stingy as I was in high school, where money was actually really tight, in college too. So another thing I want to comment on is, some people ask me, like, oh, when you make that much, do you just lose your motivation to work? And the answer is no. There's almost always something that you work toward, right? Money is this weird thing where you can never have enough for a lot of people, right? Like, there's this quote that I like from Dave Ramsey, that talk show host. And he said that money doesn't have a good or evil, right? There are no morals or intentions in money. It really just helps you be the person you want to be. It gives you optionality to do things that you want to do, right? And so what I found is that when you surround yourself with people who are other staff engineers, managers, directors, VPs of engineering, then the types of activities that those people do change, and you start to want to do the same thing. So a lot of my friends say, I have an extra $200,000 lying around this year. I'm going to do angel investing. I'm going to put in $25,000 in a bunch of companies, and that'll be how I use my money. And now all of a sudden, making $1 million a year is actually not that impressive, because you need a lot of capital to do angel investing, right? Another one is buying a house, right? If you're in the Bay Area, it'll easily cost 2 or 3 million to buy a house, and you need a ton of capital for that. People talk about their FIRE number, financial independence, retire early. And so people in Silicon Valley tell me all the time, like, oh, my FIRE number is $10 million. Once I have 10 million, I'll never need to work again. And so then you work really hard to hit that huge FIRE number. And there's an endless list of things that you could spend your money on, right? That's the thing about money. There's no, you can always do something with it, right? You could send your kid to the fanciest kindergarten in the Bay Area, which is going to cost you $30,000 a year. You could go to Burning Man. You could do a ton of other things with your money, buying a fancy car and so on. So my point in this is that it's not like there was literally no one I met who was like, okay, I made it, I'm just going to chill. Almost everyone has, like, I want to hit that bonus. I'm going to get that equity vest so I can do something with it. You're on that treadmill of just wanting more and more. There was a question earlier about taxes. I forget who asked it, but one interesting consequence here is that restricted stock units are always under withheld. I'm not sure why legally, like, this has to be, or how many people are trying to fix it. But by default, Meta only withheld 22% of your stock. Like, so if you got $100,000 worth of stock, they would only withhold 22,000, and so you'd actually get 78K. And that was definitely not enough, because in California, it's a high tax state. You probably are going to pay 10 or 11% in state tax. And then usually all of us here are going to be high income earners, and you're going to pay about 27 or 30% in federal tax. And so you should expect around 40% of your income to go in taxes. And so that's a delta between 22 and 40% that you have to now make sure you're doing accounting for that. And so the way I handled that was every quarter I would start to schedule just, hey, I'm going to pay $30,000 worth of taxes to California and the federal government, so I don't get hit with a pretty huge bill. I remember like in 2018, I think, or 2019, I got hit with like an $80,000 tax bill, and that was really unpleasant. And that happens quite a bit to people in tech. And then the other last, I think it's the last slide. There's a huge discussion around what should you do with the stock that you get vested, right? It's a huge part of your compensation. Do you just leave it sitting in that company, or do you diversify? And the correct answer from a kind of risk mitigation perspective is that you should probably be selling a majority or all of the stock that you get vested. But in reality, on the ground, most engineers, including me, held on. It's like, that's a lazy option, right? It's like every 3 months, November 15th, February 15th, etc., I would get this big chunk of Facebook stock. I just held on to it. And so that can lead to you being really concentrated in one position. And if Mark Zuckerberg decides one day to spin up a new initiative or shut down an initiative and the Facebook stock tanks because of that, tens of thousands of engineers or tech workers in general will feel the pain of that. So like, you have to be kind of deliberate. Or do you want to give one person or a couple executives at a company that much power over your finances? All right, that was all the prepared content I had. So there's kind of 3 things I would comment on to kind of sum it all up. The first is that the compensation I made in 2021 is a pretty huge number, right? Like objectively, it's one of the top incomes that you could make in the US. And I think I got lucky. I'm not like the smartest person I know. There's a lot of people smarter than me, but I got lucky. I worked hard. And there's actually a way you can achieve something similar. I'm not going to promise that everyone here is going to make 800K or more, but I think that if you build up an awareness of how companies compensate people, and also you build up your network, you can really have a big, you can really achieve a pretty huge income as well. Second is just understanding how equity works. And then third is negotiation. There's too many people are uncomfortable with negotiation, but it really is one of the highest leverage things you can do. All right, so I know we're almost at time. I'm going to stick around for another 20 minutes just to answer questions if you have any, because I want to make sure that this is like worth your while. So what you can do is you can ask questions now and I'll answer them. If we don't have time or if you have to run, then you can also ask questions in Taro. One request I have is that I think, especially in this kind of trusted community that we're building up, that we're trying to build up with Taro, I do think there's a ton of benefit from understanding how are other people thinking about compensation and how much are they making. And so if you're open to sharing your compensation, either anonymously or with your name attached, talk to me, send me a message, and I'd love to either interview you on a blog post or a video, or we can figure out whatever is comfortable for you. But I think that I got a lot of messages after the video went out that this is super helpful. And I think if we can encourage more people to share overall as tech workers, we will benefit from that. Okay, there's 2